Hello, I'm Chris Moore, host of Off Cue. Tonight we're taking a different approach to the show. Instead of hearing from our regular panelists, Fred Hansberger, Alan Cox, and Ruth Ann Daly, who will be back, by the way, next week, we are dedicating the entire half hour to the memory of Mr. Fred Rogers. We'll hear entertaining stories from some of the people who knew him best, next on Off Cue. Welcome to Off Cue, where we usually discuss a variety of topics, but tonight there is only one thing that we want to talk about, and that's the life of Fred Rogers. Let's get started and meet our guest. Bill Eisler of Family Communications Incorporated. Betsy Siemens, also with Family Communications, and David Newell, otherwise known as Mr. McFeely of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Welcome to the program, all of you. I have to tell you, in these last few days, there's been a lot of stress, a lot of sadness. I know you're all familiar with it, but there's been so much laughter, too, about the life and times of a man. And I'm hearing so many stories. I'm hoping that you all can set the record straight on some of them. For instance, how long have you two been married?
To which husband and wife?
But that's an ongoing theme about this thing, because Betsy was Mrs. McFeely and you were Mr. McFeely on the show, on the program. Did it ever cause any confusion?
Well, sometimes, yes. My wife, who's about the height, her name was Nan, is about the height of Betsy.
And we were friends before we were married. Any of us was married to, you know, each other, so, you know.
And she always get, oh, you're on the program. Yes, I see you on the program too, to my wife. And they think it's Betsy. But that's the confusion. But we straighten it out.
Straighten it all out.
Yes.
Yeah.
I've also, Bill, heard stories about once upon a time there was a monkey on the show.
We can talk about outtakes. We can talk about outtakes forever. There was one last night where Jimmy Seach, you know, switching Fred's loafers to Jimmy Seach's. Great outtakes. But one of my favorites was when it involved Mrs. McFeely. I think you should tell us about the day that you brought the monkey into the to Fred's house.
Well, actually, the sad part was that I helped work on this script. And I always had a thing for chimpanzees, and one of the things you could do was when you were working on the program, you know, ever since I was a little kid, so I wrote in, Mrs. McFeely has a chimpanzee come visit their house. Do you remember this?
In the backyard, McFeely's backyard, which had a lot of green grass.
AstroTurf.
AstroTurf.
Plastic flowers everywhere, and plastic leaves on the trees. And they brought this little chimpanzee over from the zoo, only between the time that we'd arranged for the chimpanzee to come and the time that it actually came, it had sort of gone from childhood into adolescence. And it had become basically a really vicious little animal. And none of us knew this. And we started in, but we all, you know, you didn't want to waste tape and you didn't want to waste studio time, right? Expensive studio time.
You had a budget.
We were on a budget. So the chimpanzee came out, and I started to pet it or feed it a little something, and it glommed onto my knee and started to gnaw on my kneecap, I believe.
It did, I did.
And I kept trying to talk to, well, Mr. Rogers, he's a really friendly little chimpanzee. And meanwhile, you know, this thing was digging in, and Fred, who had a pretty good sense of humor, and he knew I wasn't getting hurt, but he could see that I was scared to death, just stood there and said, well, Mrs. McFeely, you know, this chimpanzee is really fond of you, you know. And then finally, you know, it was cut, and the chimpanzee went back, and we tried to talk through it, and we all actually finally had this on the Dick Clark
outtake program.
It was on Dick Clark's outtakes, but the final, it bit your ankle, and you screamed, and that was the end. And then it jumped up to the light fixtures and swung from light fixture to light fixture, and we couldn't use the tape at all except for an outtake.
Oh my goodness, that could have destrored the lighting and everything. I was swinging from the grid.
But I think a little postscript to that is that we rehearsed with the chimp with the lights down. and we turned the lights, studio lights up for the take, and I think that had something to do with it too. So all those combinations.
But one of the other things Betsy mentioned in this discussion was
so
about
funny.
not stopping tape. And again, because of the budget, you know, PBS, there's not a lot of money. Fred did not like to stop and start again. And that was,
We all knew that we were going to carry on no matter what, and we're through a lot of things.
Yes, through a lot of things. There was a time, Fred has a great sense of humor. I think what I miss most about Fred is his sense of humor. It was very whimsical too. And there's another scene in the McFeely house. I don't know if you remember this. And that Fred, there was a front porch to Mr. McFeely's house, and Fred came over for milk and cookies. And that was starting the scene, and then we were going to talk about something that I had there. So Fred took a sip of milk, and this was not in the script, and he looked at me and said, "That's very good. Mr. McFeely, do you have a cow?" And it was not, I said, "Where is that coming from?" and he was, I think, seeing how I could get out of this. And somehow I said, "Well, yes, I do. I made up a story about having a cow. There's a barn in the back." And we got through the scene. And we took it, and somehow we got through it. So the next day, I think, or the next week, he had to write in that McFeely's had a cow. Remember?
And then we got a cow.
Then we got a cow.
And then I had to milk the cow.
You had all the great experiences with the animals, huh, Betsy? It was that whimsical sense of humor that everybody talks about. David, I believe you told me when I was interviewing you the other day that his sense of humor was whimsical. It wasn't, you know, tell 15 jokes in a row, bam, 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 take my wife, please. It was just a sense of whimsy about the world and his everyday observances.
Yes, Fred, I think I told you about one more. You've used that somewhere, but I'll tell you one more time for your audience that when the tape would break or something would happen, they would say, "Okay, Fred, one more take. And they would do it, and that became a sort of a password between the two of us, and we'd see each other in the morning. He'd put up his finger, one more, and it became a greeting. And it's Fred's just sense, and he doesn't forget things like that. He kept...
Well, he didn't forget it. And the other thing is we used to try to catch him off guard all the time. I mean, one of the stories that I tell is dealing with Joanne, his wife, and I call her Mother. And it comes from a time we were in New York at a black tie event, and Fred used to always say, and this is my wife, Joanne Bird Rogers, and this is Bill Eisler at that time. I was vice president of family communications, and I was just, I mean, I heard it 40 times. So he says, "This is my wife, Joanne Bird Rogers," and I stuck my hand out, and I said, "Hi, I'm Bill Eisler. I'm Joanne's son by her first marriage." And she didn't even stop. She said, "And we are so proud of everything he's accomplished." And Fred is like, "No, and so that became, he said, when we walked out of it, he says, "Well, you can just go home with your mother." I mean, you couldn't get Fred. I mean, he really would come back at you, and he had a great sense of humor all the time. But we used to have fun in the office. We have office stories, too. He used to tell... he used to answer the phone sometimes. I just told George Mouses the other day that I had just started here, and it was a holiday. There was nobody here. And the phone started to ring, and he said, "Should I answer the phone?" And I said, "Yes." And he answered it in one of the puppet voices. And he looks at me, and his eyes got real big. He went, "It's Elsie Hillman." So he sort of carried through. I mean, he never stopped. I don't know if Elsie remembers that, but, you know, he'd be at your house and answer the phone in a puppet voice. But he just all the time.
One of the things they say was his memory. He didn't forget birthdays. He didn't forget almost anything about your personal life, your children. Betsy, your children grew up in the building, in the neighborhood, didn't they?
The first thing I remember when I came out of the delivery room when Annie was born was Fred Rogers was standing in the corridor, and he walked me to my room, and he was with me when Joe was there too. But Fred, I think, and Sam Newberry, and he had been waiting at McGee Hospital, and he was there the whole way, visiting the kids. You know, he sometimes used to show up on Christmas morning with a little something for the kids.
And I have a similar story. I was in the hospital for a parathyroid operation, and Fred, my wife had to take our one son to the doctor, and so when I went in the delivery room, and
side of you we don't know,
into the operating room, apparently Fred stayed, and the first person I saw when I came out of the
Anesthesia.
Yeah, was Fred, and said, everything's fine, David, I'm going to go now. And he left, and my wife hadn't come back yet, so.
At the beginning of that story is even better. When you were in the hospital and they knew you were going to have surgery, he said to everybody, this is Mr. McFeely.
Yes.
Don't do anything, because we need Mr. McFeely back.
Well, what was that like playing Mr. McFeely next to Mr. Rogers all those years? I mean, you two were very close together, not only in characters on the show, but in private life, too.
Yeah, I loved doing Mr. McFeely, and I think Fred enjoyed, this is another part of his sense of humor. I'm not a very good singer, but I'll try. And Fred wrote 2 songs called a Speedy Delivery Patter song. And it took me a while, and the crew always used to enjoy when I first get a new song. It would take me a few times to get the notes right. And I don't think I ever got them totally right. And Fred knew I would not get them right. It's probably hurting his ears because he had perfect pitch. But I could see him when I would be, Speedy Delivery to You, I'd be singing it. I could see him out of the side of my eyes chuckling and sort of enjoying me going through the song. But it was, when we were doing the scenes, I would make a lot of deliveries to the interior of the house. It was wonderful. I could feel him enjoying that part. I really enjoyed the give and take of those scenes. It was wonderful memories.
I have to tell you, too, that the sight of David would just make Fred Rogers smile. All David had to do was be within his eyesight, and you could just see Fred light up. He felt safe, and David made him laugh.
And I felt that, too. In some way, I don't know if, I just felt good when I came into the room, once we had our lines down. And because we didn't have much rehearsal, we would walk through it once, and then we'd try taping it. And if we're lucky, as Bill said, we couldn't afford to go back, and it was precious studio time. So we would do the best we can, but we had great time. I think the best time of all was working with Fred in those scenes throughout the years. Oh, and one time, this goes to back to this cow story. We taped the cow story separately, and then we did the entrance where Fred would come in first, and then the next scene would be where we were with the cow. So as I was standing there, and Fred started the scene. I said, don't forget about the cow, just as he was going in the door. And he got halfway through the Beautiful Neighbors and started to laugh. And laughed, and they kept going. He just kept laughing, and finally they had to stop. But that just hit him, it just hit his sense of whimsy about the cow, because we had gone through the scene of the week before.
One of the things that's happened since Fred's death is that so many emails have come into the family communication site, and one of them that I can remember people talking about was how so many people, young people, really appreciated going out into various venues and seeing how things were made. Mm-hmm. That was another thing that people talk about. And I know you all have gotten so many emails and letters and cards and bouquets of flowers and that sort of stuff. Were there any things that have really impressed you in all of that, Bill, that's come in the last couple of days?
It's overwhelming. And we're hearing from people that we have, and I got a call today from somebody that Fred and I had worked on a publishing project with. I haven't seen him in 12 years. He called and said, I told him the last time we were together, we knew where we were, we knew what it was about. It's just overwhelming, the people that he touched, and the way the responses are coming back to us now. I mean, we're hearing from people it's amazing.
As you said 12 years ago, I'm doing the same thing. I'm getting emails from people that we've worked with over the years. I got a great call today from Bob McGrath from Sesame Street, who called, and he just heard about it. He was in Vancouver. And we got an email, or I got an email from David Hartman, that's where Fred first met. David Hartman was on the Good Morning America.
That's a good story to tell, though. Fred did not watch a lot of television. I mean, contrary to popular belief, he was not up on a lot of people who were in television.
Right.
And Fred and David were in New York at a hotel. And this gentleman came over and said, "Excuse me, Mr. Rogers, I hate to interrupt you, but my 3 sons have grown up with you. Would you come over to meet them?" And Fred went over, and he talked to the family, as he always would, spent about 5-10 minutes. He came back, and David is excited. He says, Fred, you know who that is? He said, "Yes, it's Mr. and Mrs. Hartman and their 3 sons." David says, "No, it's the David Hartman from Good Morning America." Fred says, "Well, he's a very nice man, and it's a very nice family," and off they went. Now, they have become very close friends. over the years. And I think it's pretty typical when we would see people and they would come up to Fred, and he would always be very kind to them. But sometimes you would have to sort of whisper in the back of his ear who they were, because he just didn't watch a lot of television.
Was it also difficult? Was it a disruption? Because I said on another program, having worked here 22 years, if I had a visitor in the building, it could be my mom, it could be a young student that I was working with, it could be anybody here on business talking about a program. If we were walking down the halls and bumped into Fred, he would stop and talk to him forever, like he had nothing else in the world to do, not another care in the world. Did that kind of get in the way of business in any way sometimes?
I think it got in the way of travel a lot. We would try to move him, and people would come up, and Fred wouldn't, you couldn't get him to move because he would concentrate on the person and the time. And one of the things we heard a lot of is people who learned how to speak English watching The Neighborhood.
Because he spoke so slowly and distinct. I heard Lynn Cullen talking about that on her talk show today.
Yeah. Ricky Martin, on a talk show that he was on, said the same thing, that he learned to speak English by watching The Neighborhood.
We have a few samplings of some emails that have come in, and we'd like to take a look at some of them now, if we can put them up on the screen. I think this first one comes from Robinson, Illinois, and it says, Mr. Rogers was a wonderful man and a wonderful role model for our children. Now I am sure he is in God's neighborhood. That's the kind of sentiment that you've been hearing about all day, right?
Yeah.
And how many do we get a second?
We're getting like one a second that are coming in, and it's actually not only the familycommunications.org website, the FCI.org, it's WQED.org, it's PBS Children's. It has just been overwhelming to us, just been overwhelming.
I understand it's been about 6.5 million hits from around the world, in fact. This next one comes from Memphis, Tennessee. Let's take a look at that. It's always good to know that someone you love is loved by others, more than I can say in a letter. It saddens me that he has passed on. Again, that's the kind of feeling that we've had throughout this building the whole time. It's almost unbelievable. Newspapers everywhere, cover stories, front page. Do you think that he knew the kind of impact he had on others' lives?
In some way, I think he did, but it really is something that he didn't concentrate on. That was not important to Fred, the being a star. I think he, as Bill was talking about, I think he enjoyed talking to the child in the airport more than he would concentrate on being a television star. But on some level, I think he knew that he had an impact, but he used it for the good.
I was talking to Betsy earlier today because she's working on a project with us. Fred, I think, was more impressed with the types of people that worked around him, to have Betsy and Joe Siemens working with him. I don't think he took the work seriously, very seriously. I don't think he took himself as a person seriously, but he never considered himself a hero. He never knew what all the hoopla was about. Even the final thing he did at the Rose Bowl, I think he was just overwhelmed at the response in that parade. 5 hours, 2.5 miles, a long time, lots of people. Joanne Rogers had a quote today about he was my icon long before he was the America's icon. I mean, he would enjoy the one-on-one with Chris Moore as opposed to all the hoopla out with other people.
Right.
And the pride that he took from the people he worked with over the years was, I mean, that's what I remember.
But there was also this sense of strength that he had. We've seen the videotape of his testimony before Congress where people didn't know him. And he reduced senators, the House of Representatives, to just like, well, here's the money, sure, what is it that you need, sir? He had an inner strength through his gentleness that really changed things and changed people, I think.
Yeah.
Well, he also, and I'm sure people have talked about this a great deal, but his understanding of communication is something that I don't know who has a more powerful understanding of communication than what he has. And among other things, he knew that if you speak very quietly to someone, they have to be quiet to listen to you. That he had tremendous power as a communicator, both one-on-one, as everyone sitting here knows that without ever raising his voice, he could get your full attention and your full cooperation. And he understood that about the camera. His understanding of the camera, Chris, was just phenomenal. And the crew that worked with him for so many years, they all understood that. But something very unusual in this whole world of broadcasting, I think.
And his, people said, does Fred ever get angry? And no, he didn't throw a sneaker across the studio when he got angry, but he did go to the piano. You could tell when Fred was thinking about something or was really working things out. He'd go and go to the piano. You could almost tell the tone of the music, what he was feeling. And he always said that he got his anger out through his fingers, sort of a modulated way of getting angry.
I may know the answer to this question, I may not, but do you think he had heroes?
Oh, yeah.
Well, Albert Schweitzer was one.
I think one of the stories I'll never forget is that David and I used to travel a lot with him, and he was at the National Press Club. And we said to him before we left the hotel, we said, Fred, they're going to ask you final question. If you were a combination of two people, who would they be? And he said, what kind of a question is that? That's a silly question. We're going out, we're saying Fred. So David and I are sitting in the back, and he said, okay, Mr. Rogers, the final question is, if you were a combination of two people, who would it be? And he said, Albert Schweitzer and Arsenio Hall. And David and I looked at each other and said, Arsenio, where did this come from? And of course, one of the great pieces of tape is when Fred was on the Arsenio Hall show. And he, I mean, those two were like magic together. But you'd never know what was going to come out of his mouth.
But Fred also had this knack for accepting things gracefully. As a vegetarian, he would never wear a leather jacket. Arsenio Hall gave him a leather jacket, and he just put it on and it's something he would have never done personally.
No, and it was very spontaneous, because when we got back to the hotel, there were phone numbers in the pockets.
It was actually Magic Johnson had given it to Arsenio Hall.
Worn it on a tape,
benefit or something.
On a tape they'd done, right.
And Fred has it. I think he gave it to one of his sons, but it was a prized possession.
But talking about rising to the occasion,
Yes.
do either of you remember seeing him on, I think it was the Today Show with Henry Kissinger?
Oh, yes,
It was fabulous.
And they asked him, well, David, you can probably tell it
I was there.
better. This was so funny, and he was so gracious under the most ludicrous circumstances.
During the holiday times, they have celebrities come to the outside of the Today Show and collect money for Toys for Tots, something like that.
And toys.
And toys. And they put these celebrities in Santa Claus hats. And the celebrities that day, and why they said yes, I don't know, were Henry Kissinger and Fred Rogers going around with
Santa hats
and a sack,
on
collecting the
Fifth
toys
Avenue.
on television. And Henry Kissinger said, well, what do I do? I do. You just, Mr. Kissinger, you just follow me. I don't think he knew why he was there.
Not his tradition.
Yeah, right.
That's tradition. But it was very funny. And as Betsy said,
And Fred led Henry Kissinger through the
around.
and you could see it on TV. We were just at home watching it. And he sort of led Henry Kissinger out onto Fifth Avenue and explained to him and helped him.
Open the bag.
It was so funny, and Fred just carried it off without a hitch.
and Kissinger was, I think he thought he was coming there probably to be interviewed, not to wear Santa's hat. But they were both good sports. And as Betsy said, Fred and Henry both carried it off.
There's just a magic about the man that I think everybody realized. And I don't know, having been so close to him and being able to see him every day in the hall or driving out from his parking space and back and forth, if we really appreciated him as much as we do now that he's passed. And that's a shame. I don't know. He was such a magical person.
You know, one time Fred was on the David Letterman show, and the guests that night, this was when Letterman had his old show, and the guests were Fred, Julie Andrews, and Andy Kaufman. Remember the comedian, Andy, you'd never know what he's going to say. Well, outside before they taped, Andy Kaufman came up to Fred, and he was very sincere, and he said, Mr. Rogers, I love your work. And he wasn't putting him on. And so on some level, people respected it and appreciated Fred, but on the other level, I think there was two waves. I don't think a lot of people understood the program, but as the years went on, I think they did. You know,
there were a lot of parodies too.
Yes.
The famous Saturday Night Live with Eddie Murphy. Do you think those were mean-spirited at all? And did Fred receive them in that way?
And he thought they were affectionate parodies. And as I was telling in an earlier interview, we met for, can I tell it again? We have time? We went up to the 8th floor of where ironically they taped Saturday Night Live, and that's where Fred did his first television show at 8H when he worked for NBC. To make a long story short, we went to they said his dressing room's over there. Why don't you go over and surprise him, take Fred over? So we went over and Fred knocked on the door, and the door opened and there was Eddie Murphy, and he backed up. He never expected to see Fred Rogers. And they gave Fred a big hug and said, the real Mr. Rogers, and somebody took a Polaroid, and
you still have it in your office.
I still have it. That was a wonderful moment. And then Eddie Murphy would tell that story on different talk shows.
But Fred would use that as an example. He would use Eddie Murphy as not demeaning people.
Exactly.
He never felt that Eddie Murphy was demeaning him. And he would use that as an example of you can have a sense of humor and have some fun.
Was Fred ever a critic of some of the demeaning things that comics do or that television does to human beings nowadays? Because most humor nowadays that I see on TV is based on somebody else's misfortune.
Well, it started out, that's how he got into children's television in a way. He would see, back in the early 50s, people throwing pies at each other, and it was probably versions of the Three Stooges being spliced together for entertaining children, which is nothing wrong with the Three Stooges, but Fred didn't think that was appropriate for young children. And that's what he thought was demeaning, and that's what got him into children's television.
We've got less than a minute left, but I wanted to, Bill, can I start with you and go down the line? With any final words that you would say about
you
Fred?
know, when you said about the people, do you think we appreciated them? You know, I think watching 4 hours last night, it was just overwhelming how really phenomenal this man's body of work is.
Betsy?
I just think we were privileged to be in the presence and work with a great, great man.
Amen.
I feel the same way, but yesterday during the hubbub of all the calls coming in, I had about a minute to have a sandwich, and I went to the front room and had a sandwich, and then when it hit me, I remember tearing up as I was eating my sandwich and said, you know, I'll miss him. And then the phone rang, and it got me back off of that to get through the rest of the day. But I will miss him, and we'll all miss him. And there was one of a kind. There'll never be another one like him. But thank goodness we have 900 programs that we can show on public television for a long time to come.
Well, I want to thank you all for being here and sharing this time with us on our.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's very important.
Everybody here.
All right. Now, if you'd like to share your thoughts about Mr. Rogers or any other topic, just email us at wqed.org and follow the television links to Off Cue. There you can comment on the show or offer suggestions. Again, just thank you very much. It's been a personal journey for me, too, knowing Fred Rogers 22 years and how important he was in all of our lives. Thank you very much for being here with us. Good night.